Hi everyone, and welcome to this video about proofreading, editing, and revision, which is a step-by-step guide to preparing your writing for submission. So what do I mean by submission? Well, it could be uploading and submitting an essay on D2L, like we do in this class. Or it could be submitting a hard copy of a paper that you've printed out to your professor in a regular face-to-face college class. Or even if you go on to publish something in your field, it could be submitting to a journal or a publisher like a book company. But either way, it's getting you from step A, which is drafting, to the final step, which is perfecting and making sure that your submission or your final essay or piece of writing that you're working from is completely error-free. So before you get started, you'll need to have a draft of a paper that you're working on. It can be either a printed copy or you can just pull the document up on your computer. I would suggest pausing the video now and getting that ready to go. That way you don't have to hunt for it later on during the middle of the video. So one of the important things to recognize when you're actually going to write a paper is that writing is really only half the job of writing. And what that means is that writing is a process. And the writing process begins even before you put pen to paper, your fingers to the keyboard, in the form of preliminary research, brainstorming, and note-taking. Then once you finish writing the paper out the first time, the process continues. In every case, the first paper you write will never be the finished essay, but it will only be the first draft. As you go over it each time to improve it, you'll create a second draft, third draft, and as many as are necessary to get the job right. Your final draft, edited and proofread, is your essay, ready for your reader's eyes. A lot of times when we're thinking about editing, we're actually thinking about the very small final stage, which is proofreading. Sometimes we forget that there's a whole lot of other things you can do to an essay to make it perfect. And that's not just making sure you have little typos. So starting with proofreading, which is the final step, you're preparing your writing for submission. So when you proofread, you're checking for small-scale errors like typos, grammar, and formatting. So editing is the preliminary step before you proofread. Editing focuses on how the language works. You look at both words and sentences to see if they adequately convey your meaning. You can also check for grammatical errors here. Revision is the first step. That's after you complete your draft. Revision looks at large-scale problems on the level of the paragraph and the entire structure of the paper. So before you get to proofreading, before you get to editing, it's important to look at your paper in a holistic way to see if there are any big things that you need to tackle before you focus on the little details. But before you even get to revising an essay, you need to take a step away from it. So even though you often are going to be writing on a time constraint, it's important to remember that taking a step away from your paper is a really important thing to do. Professional writers may take months or even years to perfect an essay. Of course, all that time isn't spent making the essay perfect, where they're actually sitting at their computer and focusing on every single word in detail. A lot of that time is spent doing other things, and that gives you a little breathing room between you and your paper. So give yourself breaks while writing. When you're done, let your writing sit for a while to get a new perspective. Revisit it in a few days, or at least give yourself a few hours if you can't afford a few days. So your essay might make more sense if you sleep on it, or it might make less sense after you've slept on it. At least you'll know which. When you let yourself get away from your paper for a few days, it creates a little bit of a mental break between you and the person you were when you wrote that paper. And why this is important is because when you go back to revise a paper, if you've gotten away from that headspace that you were in, you'll look at it with fresh eyes. You won't be seeing it as it was when you were writing it. You'll be seeing it from a new perspective. In other words, instead of seeing what you thought you wrote or what you meant to say, you'll be seeing more clearly what you actually wrote. In this way, all of those errors, those jumps in logic, confusing sentences, and everything that could be corrected will be that much clearer for you. So only after you've had a little bit of time to step away from your essay is it time to revise your essay. And keep in mind that this might not be such a broken up or linear process. You might write a chunk of paper, step away from it, revise that chunk of paper, write another section of your paper, step away from it, revisit the first section of the paper, and so forth. But the general procedure is the same, regardless of whether or not you're working on an entire draft or you're working on it piecemeal, one section at a time. So revision of an essay is not simply proofreading, and that's something I'm repeating a lot, but it's a really important thing to take away from this. So when I'm asking you to thoroughly revise an essay between your peer review draft and your final draft, what I'm asking you to do is take a really thorough second look at your essay. No spell check feature can help you with true revision. Revision means what it looks like. Revision. Determining how you see things now, beyond or better than you saw things when you first started working on your paper. The act of revision acknowledges that you've grown intellectually over the course of writing your paper too, and it's something that I'm looking for as a teacher. So if you don't revise between your drafts, it's kind of like you're modestly proposing that your first thoughts on the subject were immaculate and inarguably correct. So how often is that the case? So there are many different ways you can revise an essay, but I'm going to suggest dividing it up into two major components. The first one is diagnosing and analyzing, and the second is making global changes. Diagnosing and analyzing is when you determine if your thesis and your body paragraphs really express your vision for your argument. When you're working on making global changes or large-scale changes across your paper, you'll work on both individual ideas and you'll consider the arrangement of these points. So you might develop your points, adding discussion or evidence, clarifying things in your own words or using another person's words, for instance, the ideas from a source to help clarify an idea. Or you might decide that there's just too much going on and you need to cut or eliminate sentences or paragraphs to make an argument more pointed, more to the point, concise, and easy to understand. So you'll also consider the flow of these points. And you want to make sure when you're doing this that you're not dwelling on small-scale problems. So notice how I didn't say anything about sentences or individual words, except for that you might eliminate a sentence to make a point clear. You're focusing on your argument, the points you're making, and how well you're making those points. So little things like grammatical errors and typos and stuff like that, if you notice one, and it's easy to fix, go ahead and fix it, but don't worry about perfecting those things because you might have trouble seeing the forest for the trees if you focus on the little things. So let's take a moment to do an activity where we practice diagnosis and analysis. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and grab that draft of your paper, either a printed copy or pull up the document on your computer. So on 1 or 2 pages of a clean draft of your paper, you want to go ahead and underline the first few words of every sentence. That's right, every single sentence, ignoring short introductory phrases such as in the beginning or for the most part. You know, those little snippets of text that happen before a comma. Just the first important words of the sentence. If you're using a document on your computer, you can use the underline feature. Otherwise, you just underline by hand. So pause the video now, and when you're done underlining the first few words of every sentence, go ahead and start it up again. So now that you've underlined the first words of every sentence in every paragraph for a few pages, you'll want to read your underlined words paragraph by paragraph. As you're reading, you want to ask yourself, is there a consistent series of related topics across all paragraphs? What about in each paragraph? Is the flow of ideas jumpy, or will your reader see these connections among the topics? Do your sentences hang together? So as you're reading through those underlined words, and only the first few words, you should get a sense of what we call the flow of your essay. And because it's only the first few important words, this is where the subject of your sentence usually happens. So therefore, the flow of the subjects of your sentences will be very clear. You'll be able to see how your topics move from one point to the next just by looking at the first few sentences. And it will also help you see things more clearly because you're only looking at a few words. So you're looking at just the most concise version of each topic. It really helps you see how everything connects. Once you've done this, what you'll want to do is give each section or paragraph a title based on these topics that are becoming revealed as you're looking at just these little snippets of text. So the words in the title of each paragraph should identify the topics of most of the sentences in that paragraph. In other words, as you're looking through the first few words that you underlined, the topic of that paragraph should be clear. You should be able to come up with a title that acts as an umbrella for the topics of everything in that paragraph. And ask yourself as you're doing this, is it hard to come up with one? Because if it's really hard, chances are you're trying to tackle more than one concise topic in that paragraph, which is, of course, one of those no-nos for paragraphing. You want to have only one topic per paragraph. So go ahead and pause the video here, read your sentences aloud, and start thinking about what those sentences are telling you, and then give each paragraph or section of your paper, if there's a series of really connected paragraphs, a title, and see how easy or hard it is to come up with that. So the first part of that activity is diagnosis. Just like a doctor, you're kind of looking for the problematic areas of your essay, diagnosing that a problem exists. The second part of this activity is called analysis. And here you're going to determine or redetermine the focus of each paragraph, evaluate your evidence, and relate all your points to your main goal. So when you're thinking about the focus of your paragraph, you want to think, is my paragraph cohesive? Is it repetitive? Are my points in the right order? Are my paragraphs in the right order? Is each paragraph the right size, or is one of them trying to do too much? When you evaluate your evidence, you want to think about your evidence. Is it effective, meaning that it's really doing a good job at proving my point? Is it clear? Is it high quality, convincing, necessary, or sufficient? And then you want to make sure that all your points are relating to your main goal. Does everything make sense in terms of your thesis? Does your thesis need to change? Like after you've read your entire paper, do you realize that maybe my thesis is not accurately reflecting what I'm actually arguing? Or maybe you determine my thesis is great, I want to keep my thesis, but I'm not really adhering to it. How can I better adhere to that thesis? Diagnosing and analyzing is only the first step. You've read through your marked up paper from beginning to end, or in this activity, the first couple of pages, and you've taken note of changes you want to make. You've analyzed your problems and considered what changes you need to make to address those problems. Now it's time to actually make the changes. This is where you begin revising, working on a new document, and this is very important. Make a copy of your document or a duplicate of it and save it under a new title. This is especially important if you're working on a digital copy that has a lot of notes on it. For instance, a peer-reviewed version of a draft up in Google Docs. You can then dismiss or resolve your comments that a peer makes or that you've made on your paper, and you don't have all of those notes and everything cluttering it up. And then you have that version to go back to should you need to look up and see what somebody had suggested to you or notes that you had made previously. So you can either make your changes sequentially, that means from beginning to end, or you can attack the areas that need the most work first, which will be clearer because you've done that diagnosis and analyzing. So I recognize that you probably won't always have all the time in the world. So here are some tips for quick revision if you have a tight deadline. Firstly, don't try to edit as you go along. Read through the whole essay one time before touching anything. Then think about the overall order of your points. Add transitions between paragraphs after you've determined the right order for each paragraph. And if you come across a paragraph that feels like a tangent, cross it out. Or a paragraph where you're just talking and you're not incorporating your evidence, make a note that you need to incorporate some evidence in there. And if you're really having a hard time making a point, just put a bracket around it. It might be something that you can consider cutting. Lastly, save revising the intro and conclusion for absolute last until you're sure you know what you're going to be saying with your paper. And lastly, peer review is an important part of the revision process. Here are some questions that you can have anyone answer regarding your paper to help you make it even better.